dust of the sale yard tasted of defeat. It coated Elara Vance's tongue, a gritty testament to the end of everything she had ever known. She stood on the rough-hewn planks of the auction block, a prisoner in a threadbare calico dress, the frayed edges whispering of a life that was no longer hers. Below her, a sea of faces swam in the blistering sun, callous, curious, hungry. They weren't looking at a person, they were looking at property, livestock, an indentured servant to be bought and paid for, her life's ledger wiped clean and rewritten by the highest bidder. The man responsible for her ruin, Jedediah Thorne, stood beside the auctioneer, his portly frame squeezed into a suit that strained at the seams, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had taken her family's farm, the deed signed over to cover manufactured debts, and now he was selling her off to cover the final, insulting pennies. It was a spectacle of his power, a warning to anyone else in the valley who might defy him. Elara kept her chin high, a solitary act of rebellion in a world that had stripped her of all else. Her gaze swept over the crowd, not with pleading but with a cold, quiet fury that she hoped burned them. She would not cry. She would not give Thorne the satisfaction of her tears. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met the indifferent stares, the lecherous grins, the pitying glances that were almost worse. Then, her gaze snagged on a figure at the very back of the crowd, half hidden in the long shadow of the livery stable. He was a monolith of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark, practical rancher's clothes. He was still as a statue, his face unreadable beneath the brim of a low-pulled hat. Unlike the others, he wasn't leering or whispering, he was just watching, his attention fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. There was something desolate about him, a profound loneliness that seemed to emanate from him like heat from the parched earth. Elara felt a strange, unwelcome flicker of connection to this stranger's solitude, a shared emptiness in the midst of the boisterous, cruel crowd. She saw a faint, pale scar that cut across the back of his hand as he shifted his weight, the only movement he had made. The auctioneer's voice boomed, listing her supposed skills. Cooking, cleaning, mending, obedience. Each word was a lash, stripping away another layer of her identity. "Let's start the bidding at $20 for this fine, healthy young woman," Thorne declared, his voice slick with false bonhomie. A few jeers and lowball offers rose from the crowd. 25, 30, the numbers climbed slowly, insultingly. This was the sum of her life, the price of a good horse. She held the stranger's gaze, her last anchor in a sea of degradation. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He just watched, his expression unchanging. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not pity, but a cold, hard recognition. Shared understanding of loss, perhaps. The bidding stalled at $60. $60 going once, the auctioneer cried out, his hammer raised. Going twice. Elara braced herself, her heart a cold stone in her chest. This was it. Her future was about to be sealed by some grimy farmer or a saloon owner looking for cheap labor. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but to lock away the last image of her own defiance. A voice, deep and resonant as a thunderclap, rolled across the stunned silence of the sale yard. $1,000! Every head whipped around. The sound had come from the tall, silent stranger at the back. He had stepped out of the shadows, and now the full force of the sun caught him. His face was hard, carved from granite and grief, his eyes the color of a winter sky. Jedediah Thorne's jaw dropped, his smug expression melting into disbelief. The auctioneer stammered, his hammer frozen mid-air. $1,000? He squeaked, his voice cracking. The stranger didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The offer hung in the air, a solid, immovable fact. It wasn't a bid. It was a declaration. It was so far beyond any reasonable price that it silenced all competition, turning the grubby transaction into something else entirely. Thorne, recovering his composure, narrowed his eyes. "Who are you, friend? That's a steep price for a field hand." The stranger's gaze shifted from Elara to Thorne, and the temperature of the yard seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "The name is Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice level and cold. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Silas Blackwood, the millionaire rancher from the high country, a man who owned more land than anyone in the state, a recluse who rarely came down to the valley, a figure of myth and rumor. They said he was scarred by tragedy, that he had built his empire with his bare hands after losing everything. They said he was a man best left alone. "I can afford it," Blackwood added, the simple words carrying an unmistakable threat. He held Thorne's gaze for a long moment. A silent battle of wills fought over the heads of the stunned townsfolk. Thorne, for the first time, looked uncertain. He was a big fish in a small pond, but Silas Blackwood was a leviathan from the deep. Finally, Thorne gave a curt, angry nod to the auctioneer. "Sold," the auctioneer finally croaked, slamming his hammer down with a resounding crack that seemed to echo the breaking of Elara's chains. "Sold to Mr. Silas Blackwood for $1,000. Elara watched, breathless, as Silas moved through the parting crowd. He walked with a purpose that was unnerving, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust with each step. He ignored Thorne completely, his eyes fixed only on her. He mounted the steps of the auction block, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. He was even taller up close, his shadow falling over her, shielding her from the sun and the prying eyes. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick wad of bills bound by a leather strap, and tossed it to the stunned auctioneer without a glance. Then he turned to her. He produced a knife from his belt, its blade clean and sharp. For a terrifying second, her breath caught in her throat, but he merely reached behind her and with one swift, clean slice, cut the rope that bound her wrists. The frayed ends fell away. She was free, but she had never felt more adrift. He said nothing. He simply nodded toward the steps, a silent order to follow. Elara rubbed her chafed wrists, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She had been bought. Rescued from Thorne, yes, but what new prison awaited her? This silent, formidable man had paid a fortune for her. Why? She looked into his eyes, searching for a clue, an answer. She found nothing but a vast, guarded emptiness, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She took a tentative step, then another, following him down from the block and away from the life that had been stolen from her. The walk through the town was a silent ordeal. The townsfolk stared, their whispers following them like flies. Elara kept her eyes fixed on the broad back of the man in front of her. Silas Blackwood. He was her shield, her captor, her enigma. He didn't speak a word, his long strides eating up the dusty ground, forcing her to nearly run to keep pace. He led her to a large, sturdy wagon, its bed loaded with supplies, hitched to two powerful draft horses. He stopped and turned to her, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Get in," he said. It wasn't a request. Elara hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fear warring with a desperate need to understand. "Why?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse and dust. "Where did you do that?" Silas looked at her, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed his face, something akin to wary impatience. "Thorne is a vulture. I don't like vultures." He gestured to the wagon again. "Get in, it's a long ride." His answer explained nothing and everything. It wasn't about her, she realized. It was about him, about his dislike for men like Thorne. She was just a pawn in a game played by powerful men. With a heavy heart, she climbed onto the wagon seat, her simple dress feeling coarse and alien against the smooth leather. Silas swung up beside her, the wooden bench groaning under his weight. He took up the reins and with a soft click of his tongue set the horses in motion. They left the town of Redemption behind, the whispers and stares fading with the last of the buildings. The road stretched out before them, a dusty ribbon winding its way into the foothills and toward the distant hazy mountains. The silence in the wagon was a living thing, heavy and oppressive. The sun beat down and the landscape grew wilder, the sparse trees giving way to rugged canyons and vast open plains that seemed to go on forever. This was his land, she presumed, the Blackwood Ranch, an empire of solitude. As the hours crawled by, Elara's fear began to curdle into a slow-burning dread. What did he want from her? He had paid $1,000. A debt like that could never be repaid. She was bound to him as surely as if he had put her in iron chains. She stole glances at his profile. It was a study in severity. A strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth set in a permanent, unyielding line. The scar on his hand was old, white against his tanned skin. She wondered how he had gotten it, what other scars he carried, hidden beneath his dark clothes and his even darker silence. He was a fortress, and she was his prisoner, being transported to a dungeon she could not yet imagine. The vastness of the landscape was terrifying. It was beautiful in a brutal, untamed way. But it was empty, so terribly empty, just like the man beside her. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, Silas finally broke the suffocating silence. "We're almost there," he said, his voice a low rumble. He hadn't looked at her, his eyes remaining on the trail ahead. Ahead, nestled in a valley carved by an ancient river, was the heart of his empire. The Blackwood Ranch was not just a ranch. It was a small town unto itself. A massive barn, corrals, outbuildings, and a bunkhouse were spread out below them, all built of dark, sturdy timber. And in the center of it all, on a slight rise overlooking everything, stood the main house. It was a huge two-story structure, imposing and stark against the softening sky. It was a house built for a dynasty, for laughter and children and life. But as they drew closer, Elara saw that it had the same forbidding aura as its owner. The windows were dark eyes and a blank face. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light shone from within. It was a hollow monument to wealth and loneliness. They pulled up before the house, and Silas wordlessly climbed down and came around to her side. He stood there, waiting. Elara remained frozen on the seat, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge. The dread that had been building all day was now a knot of ice in her stomach. This was it, the door to her new cage. "I'm not," she began, her voice trembling. "I won't be." Silas looked up at her, his face shadowed by the twilight. "You won't be anything you don't want to be," he said, his tone flat, matter-of-fact. "I bought your indenture, Miss Vance. That makes me your master legally. But I have no use for a slave." He paused, and his next word seemed to cost him something. Thorn needed to be shown that not everything in this valley belongs to him. You were the message. Elara stared at him, bewildered. "A message? $1,000 message?" "The only kind a man like that understands," Silas replied. He reached up, not to grab her, but to offer a hand. It was a gesture of assistance, nothing more. Tentatively, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, calloused, but not rough. He helped her down to the ground, her legs unsteady after the long journey. His hand was large and warm, and the brief contact sent a confusing jolt through her. He released her as soon as her feet were planted, turning to unhitch the horses. "There's food in the pantry. You can take the room at the top of the stairs to the left. It's clean." He spoke like he was giving instructions to a new hire, not to the woman he had just purchased in a public auction. He led the horses toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the deepening twilight, a small, lost figure before the great dark house. She was free of the auction block, but she was more alone than ever, stranded in a fortress of solitude with a man made of secrets and sorrow. With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she turned and walked toward the heavy oak door of her new prison. It was unlocked. The inside of the house was just as she had imagined, vast, immaculate, and utterly devoid of life. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon oil and dust. A grand staircase swept up from a cavernous entryway. The furniture was dark, heavy, and expensive, but it looked as though it had never been used. There were no pictures on the walls, no books on the tables, no stray shawls or forgotten trinkets. It was a house, not a home. A museum of a life that had either ended or never begun. Elara found the kitchen, a large, well-precorded room that was as sterile as a surgeon's office. Following Silas's instructions, she found the pantry stocked with enough supplies to survive a long winter. She wasn't hungry, but the simple act of making food seemed like a way to reclaim some small piece of herself. She cut a slice of bread and cheese, her hands moving with a mechanical slowness. Every sound she made, the scrape of the knife, the click of the pantry door, seemed to echo in the profound silence. She ate standing in the kitchen, feeling like an intruder. Later, carrying a single candle, she made her way up the grand staircase. The banister was smooth and cool beneath her hand. She found the room he had indicated. It was large, with a comfortable-looking bed and a window that looked out over the entire valley. Like the rest of the house, it was clean, impersonal, and empty. There was a wardrobe, a washstand, and a small table, nothing else. She set the candle down and walked to the window. The lights of the bunkhouse glowed in the distance, a small pocket of life in the vast darkness. The main house remained dark except for her own small, flickering light. Where was he? She hadn't seen him since he'd led the horses away. Was he sleeping in the barn? Did he even live in this house? The thought was unsettling. She was alone in this enormous, empty place. She was exhausted, her body aching from the tension of the day, her mind numb. She undressed, leaving the hated calico dress in a heap on the floor, and washed her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher. Slipping into the bed, she pulled the crisp, clean sheets up to her chin. The bed was soft, the room was safe, but sleep would not come. She was listening for his footsteps on the stairs, listening for the sound of a key turning in a lock, listening for a sign of what her future held. But the only sound was the lonely cry of a coyote in the distant hills, a mournful sound that echoed the emptiness in her own heart. She had been rescued, but she was still a captive, trapped not by ropes and bars, but by $1,000 debt and the crushing, silent loneliness of the Blackwood Ranch. The next morning, Elara woke to the first pale light of dawn. The house was still silent. For a wild moment she wondered if the entire previous day had been a fever dream, if she would open her eyes and find herself back in her own small room on the farm. But the strange, impersonal room and the vast, rugged landscape outside her window were stark reminders of her new reality. She dressed and went downstairs, her bare feet silent on the polished wood floors. The silence was unnerving. She half expected Silas Blackwood to appear suddenly from one of the many doorways, a grim specter in his own home. But the lower floor was empty. A quick glance out the front door revealed his wagon was gone. He had left. The realization brought a confusing mix of relief and anxiety. Was he coming back? Had he simply abandoned her here? The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. She was alone, but she was also unsupervised. Drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand, she walked through the silent rooms on the ground floor. There was a formal dining room with a table that could seat 20, a parlor with stiff, uncomfortable-looking furniture, and a library with shelves full of unread books, their spines perfectly aligned. At the very back of the house she found his office. Unlike the rest of the house, this room felt lived in. The large oak desk was covered in ledgers and maps. A faint smell of tobacco and leather hung in the air. Her eyes were drawn to the only personal item in the entire house. On the corner of the desk sat a small, silver-framed photograph turned face down. A powerful curiosity, stronger than her fear, compelled her to reach out. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up and turned it over. The photograph showed a younger Silas Blackwood, his face softer, his eyes bright with a joy she couldn't imagine him possessing. His arm was around a smiling woman with kind eyes, and in his other arm he held a small girl with a mass of dark curls. They were a family, radiant with happiness. A sudden, sharp understanding pierced through Elara's confusion. This house wasn't empty because life had never begun here. It was empty because life had ended. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the echo of a profound and devastating loss. This man, this lonely, scarred millionaire, was living in a mausoleum of his own making. A wave of empathy, so strong it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. She suddenly understood his desolation, the fortress he had built around himself. He hadn't bought her as property. He had acted on a single, buried impulse of justice. And now, he didn't know what to do with her. Another living soul in his carefully curated tomb. She gently placed the photograph back on the desk, face down, just as she had found it. His secret was not hers to look at. Turning away from the desk, she felt a shift inside herself. Her fear was still there, but it was now joined by something else. A fragile, tentative sense of purpose. She could not stay here as a ghost, another shadow in his silent house. She had to do something. She had to live. Elara left the office and its sad secrets behind, walking out the back door and into the bright morning sun. Behind the house, choked with weeds and scorched by neglect, was the ghost of a garden. A broken picket fence enclosed a patch of earth where a few stubborn rose bushes struggled for life amidst the thorns and thistles. A rusted trowel lay half buried in the dirt, abandoned mid-track. It was here, she thought, looking at the tangled mess. This was where she could start. This small, forgotten plot of land felt like a reflection of her own life. Once tended and loved, now ruined and left for dead. Bringing it back to life felt like an act of defiance, a way to claw back a piece of herself. She found a pair of thick work gloves in a nearby shed, stiff with disuse, and set to work. She started with the weeds, her hands quickly growing sore as she pulled and tugged at the stubborn roots. The sun beat down on her back and sweat trickled down her temples. It was hard, punishing work, but it was honest. With every weed she pulled, she felt as though she were clearing away some of the despair that had taken root in her own heart. She worked all day, stopping only to drink water from the well pump. She cleared the dead branches from the rose bushes, her fingers clumsy but determined. She found the straight lines of old vegetable beds hidden beneath the overgrowth. As she worked, her mind was quiet for the first time in weeks. The physical exertion drowned out the fear and the confusion, leaving only the simple, satisfying reality of the earth in her hands. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the wagon approach. It was only when a shadow fell over her that she looked up, startled. Silas Blackwood stood at the edge of the garden, watching her. His face was unreadable, his eyes taking in the cleared patch of ground, the pile of weeds, and her own dirt-streaked face and torn dress. Elara scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She felt like a child caught doing something forbidden. I'm sorry," she stammered, wiping a dusty hand across her forehead. "I can stop." Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked from her to the resurrected patch of garden, his gaze lingering on the struggling rose bushes. A flicker of some deep hidden emotion crossed his face, so fleeting she almost missed it. "That was her garden," he said, his voice quiet, rough around the edges. It wasn't an accusation, it was just a statement of fact. "My wife's." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with loss. He was talking about the woman in the photograph. She loved it. He looked at Elara, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a message or a piece of property, but as a person. No one has touched it since she died. A tense silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken grief and a new fragile understanding. "It deserves to be alive," Elara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Silas just nodded, a slow, heavy movement of his head. He turned without another word and walked back toward the house. His broad shoulders slumped with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical labor. Elara watched him go, then turned back to the garden, her resolve hardened. She wasn't just tending a garden for herself anymore. She was tending it for a ghost. The next day, Silas approached her as she worked in the garden. He held out a simple but sturdy dress and a pair of work boots. "These will be better for this kind of work," he said, his voice gruff. He placed them on a fence post and retreated before she could thank him. The gesture, small as it was, felt significant. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of her presence, of the small change she was making in his stagnant world. In the days that followed, a strange, unspoken routine developed between them. She would rise at dawn and work in the garden or clean the cavernous house, trying to breathe life back into it. He would leave early to work the ranch and return at dusk. They ate their meals in the kitchen in a silence that was no longer oppressive but companionable. It was a quiet truce, a shared solitude. One evening, as a storm rolled in over the mountains, trapping them indoors, he finally spoke to her about something other than practicalities. "Thorn won't let this go," he said, staring out the window at the rain lashing against the glass. "He's an arrogant man. He'll see my buying you as a personal insult, a challenge to his authority in redemption." Elara paused, a dishcloth in her hands. "What will he do?" "He'll start small," Silas said, turning from the window. "Try to hurt my business, spook my cattle, try to turn the townsfolk against me. Or you." His eyes met hers, and they were dark with a grim certainty. "He'll try to prove that you're nothing but my property, that you belong to him by right of the debt he created." The thought sent a chill down her spine, colder than the rain outside. She had felt safe here in this isolated fortress, but Silas was reminding her that the walls of his ranch and his protection might not be enough. The world was still out there, and Jedediah Thorn was in it. "What do we do?" she asked, the "we" slipping out before she could stop it. Silas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He had noticed the word too. "For now, you stay here. You're safe on my land. His men won't dare set foot on it." He paused, his gaze intense. "But that won't be enough. He'll find a way to get at you, to legally challenge my purchase. The law in redemption is whatever Thorn says it is. There's only one way to protect you from him, permanently." Elara waited, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. Silas took a deep breath, the sound loud in the quiet kitchen. "We get married," he said, the words stark and devoid of any emotion. "As my wife, you're not indentured property. You're a citizen. He can't touch you. No court, not even one in his pocket, would be able to return a man's wife to a creditor." He held up a hand forestalling her immediate shocked protest. It would be a contract, Miss Vance, nothing more. A business arrangement. My name in exchange for your safety. You would be free, truly free. In this house, you would be your own person. I would ask nothing of you. Elara stared at him, speechless. A marriage of convenience. A shield made of a name. It was a cold, practical solution to a cold, cruel problem. Marry this silent, grieving stranger to escape the clutches of a monster. It was an impossible choice, but as she looked at him, at the weary honesty in his eyes, she knew it was the only choice she had. I accept, she whispered. The wedding was as Spartan and silent as the man she was marrying. Silas brought the circuit judge, a nervous, sweating man named Peters, up to the ranch. The ceremony took place in the cold, formal parlor, with only Silas's foreman, a leathery, loyal man named Clay, as a witness. Elara wore the simple dress Silas had given her. It felt more honest than any white gown. She listened as Judge Peters recited the words, her own voice a faint echo in the vast room as she spoke her vows. Silas's voice was steady and low, a strange comfort. He slid a simple gold band onto her finger. It was cool and heavy, the physical manifestation of their contract. She looked at her hand, at the ring that declared her Mrs. Blackwood. She was a wife, but not a beloved. She was safe, but not cherished. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, just a grim, formal handshake between Silas and the judge, and a quiet nod from Clay. Silas paid the judge handsomely. The man scurried away as if fleeing a haunted house. Clay tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am," he said, the words sounding foreign and respectful. Then he too was gone, leaving them alone in the parlor, husband and wife, strangers bound by a legal document. "It's done," Silas said, breaking the silence. "He can't touch you now." He looked at her, at the ring on her finger, and a complicated expression crossed his face. He seemed older, more tired than ever. "The room you are in is yours. Nothing changes." He turned to leave, to retreat back into his shell, back to his office and the ghosts that resided there. "Silas," she said, her voice stopping him at the door. He turned back, his expression guarded. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. He had spent a fortune and given her his name, all to thwart a man he despised. He gave a short, sharp nod, the closest he ever came to a smile. "Stay safe, Elara," he said, using her first name for the first time. Then he walked out, leaving her alone with her new name and the heavy gold band on her finger. Life on the ranch continued its quiet rhythm, but something had shifted between them. The contract of their marriage, meant to be a cold barrier, had instead become a strange kind of bridge. They were no longer master and servant, but partners in a shared deception. The silence at their dinner table was now filled with unspoken questions. Elara found herself watching him, noticing the way his hands, though scarred, were gentle with the horses. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes and felt a pang of a feeling she couldn't name. She continued to work in the garden, and it began to flourish under her care. The rose bushes bloomed, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber house. She planted vegetables, and the neat green rows were a promise of life and sustenance. One afternoon, Clay, the foreman, stopped by as she was weeding. "Ain't seen that garden look like that in 10 years, he said, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "The missus, his first wife, she'd be proud." He looked toward the house. "The boss ain't been the same since he lost her and the little one. It's good to see some life back in this place. Good to see him, well, not smiling, but not looking like a storm cloud all the time." Clay's words confirmed what she already knew, but hearing them aloud made the tragedy more real. She was living in the shadow of a great love, a ghost in a house of memories. As Silas had predicted, Jedediah Thorne did not take the news of their marriage well. The first sign of trouble came not as a direct attack, but as a slow poison spreading through the town of Redemption. When Clay went to town for supplies, he returned with a grim face. "The talk is ugly, boss," he reported to Silas, though he made sure Elara was within earshot. "Thorne's telling everyone that you bought yourself a harlot from the block, that the marriage is a sham to cover your debauchery." "Hey," Elara flinched as if struck. The words were meant to wound her, to strip her of her dignity and isolate her. Silas's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "He's a snake, spitting venom because he lost his prey," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Let them talk. Their words can't hurt us here, but the words did hurt. They were a reminder that she was still seen as a commodity, her worth and character determined by men in a dusty town. The isolation of the ranch, once a comfort, now felt like a cage again. The next attack was more direct. A section of fence on the southern range was cut, and 100 head of prize cattle were driven off into the canyons. It took Silas and his men 3 days of hard riding to round them up, and even then a dozen were lost. Silas returned exhausted, his face grim. He didn't speak of the incident to her, but Elara saw the new tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the Colt holstered on his hip. He was a man on high alert, a king defending his borders. The war had begun. Elara felt a surge of helpless anger. She was the cause of this, the unwilling catalyst for the conflict between these two powerful men. While Silas fought to protect his empire, she was tending a garden. She had to do more. She couldn't just be a protected treasure. She had to be an ally. Her mind went back to her father. He had been a meticulous man, a farmer who believed in planning and record-keeping. Thorn had taken all his official papers, but what about his personal effects? The one small trunk that the sheriff had grudgingly allowed her to keep was stored in the corner of her room. It contained her mother's shawl, a few worn books, and her father's old clothes. It seemed useless, but it was all she had left of them. That evening, driven by a desperate hope, she emptied the trunk onto the floor. She ran her hands over every inch of the worn wood, pressing and tapping, searching for anything her father might have hidden. He had always been clever, a man who saw the world in layers. As her fingers traced the bottom of the trunk, she felt it. A slight give, a thin line that was not part of the natural grain. Her heart leaped. Using the tip of her nail, she pried at the edge. A section of the floorboard, no thicker than a coin, lifted up. Beneath it, nestled in a shallow, hidden compartment, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with her father's neat, precise script. It wasn't a diary of his feelings, but a ledger of his dealings with Jedediah Thorn. It began years ago, detailing the first small loan for seeds, the second for a new plow. Then the terms began to change. Interest rates climbed, payments were lost. New fees were invented. It was a methodical, damning account of Thorn's predatory lending, a blueprint for how he had systematically bled her family dry. But there was more. Tucked into the back of the journal was a folded hand-drawn map. It was a map of her family's farm, but it showed something she had never known existed. In the rocky, unusable northern pasture, her father had drawn a small circle and marked it with a symbol for water. Beneath it he had written, "Artesian spring, flows year-round, even in drought. Thorn must not know." A cold, sharp clarity washed over Elara. This was it. This was the real prize. It wasn't just about her family's small plot of land. In a valley where water was more precious than gold, a guaranteed year-round spring was a source of immense power. Thorn hadn't just wanted their farm, he wanted to control the valley's lifeblood. Her father had understood Thorn's greed and had tried to protect their one true treasure. His journal was the proof of the crime, and the map was the motive. She clutched the journal to her chest, her heart hammering. This changed everything. This wasn't just a personal injustice anymore. It was a weapon that could not only clear her family's name, but could also break Thorn's corrupt hold on the entire valley. She waited for Silas to return, the journal feeling like a burning coal in her hands. When he walked into the kitchen that evening, weary from another long day, she was waiting for him at the table, the journal and the map laid out before her. "Silas," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I think I've found a way to fight back." He stopped, his eyes falling on the open book. He came closer, his weariness forgotten, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He listened in silence as she explained what she had found, her words tumbling out in a rush. She pointed to the entries in the ledger, the escalating debts, the final, fraudulent foreclosure. Then she showed him the map. He stared at the small circle, his expression unreadable. He traced the lines of the map with a scarred finger, his mind clearly working, connecting the pieces. He looked from the map to the journal, then to her. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes were not filled with grief or guarded emptiness. They were filled with a cold, calculating light. The light of a fighter who had just been handed the perfect weapon. "He overplayed his hand," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "He got greedy and careless. He never imagined your father was this meticulous." He looked at her and a new respect dawned in his eyes. She was not just a victim he had rescued, she was an ally who had brought him the key to victory. "This is enough to ruin him," Silas said. "With this, we can go to the territorial marshal, bypass Thorne's pet sheriff entirely. We can expose him for the thief he is." But a shadow of caution crossed his face. "But if he even suspects we have this, he'll stop at nothing to get it back. He won't send men to cut fences anymore. He'll come himself. He'll come for you." The knowledge of the journal changed the atmosphere on the ranch. The quiet truce was replaced by a tense, shared purpose. They were no longer just a man and a woman living in the same house. They were co-conspirators, guardians of a secret that could either save them or get them killed. Silas became even more vigilant, his rifle never far from his hand. He doubled the night watch and sent Clay to the nearest town in the opposite direction from Redemption to send a wire to the territorial marshal in the capital. The message was cryptic, speaking of land fraud and requesting an immediate presence. Now it was a waiting game, a race between the arrival of the law and the inevitable arrival of Thorne. Elara felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overlaid with a steely resolve. She had found the weapon, and now she would see the fight through to the end. She refused to hide. She continued her work in the house and garden, a small, stubborn act of normalcy in the face of the coming storm. The sight of her tending the now blooming roses seemed to give Silas a quiet strength. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, the silence was broken by Silas. "My daughter would have been about your age," he said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. He was staring into the middle distance, seeing a ghost. Elara's heart ached for him. She and her mother, they were caught in a flash flood down in the canyon. I was away, buying cattle. By the time I got back, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The story was carved into every line on his face. "I built this empire for them," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "When they were gone, it all turned to dust. I just kept working because it was the only thing that stopped me from thinking." He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a decade of unshed tears. "I haven't felt anything but that emptiness for 10 years. Until that day in town, when I saw you on that block, standing there with nothing left but your own defiance. I felt something. Anger. I hadn't felt real anger in a long, long time." He reached across the table and his hand covered hers. His touch was warm and firm, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, forged in shared loss and a common enemy. "You brought life back to this house, Elara. Back to that garden, and back to me." The raw honesty of his confession left her breathless. In that moment, the contract between them dissolved, burned away by the heat of his words. This was no longer a marriage of convenience. It was something real, something fragile and precious, born in the ashes of their old lives. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers with his. "We'll see this through, Silas," she said softly. "Together." A lookout rider came thundering into the yard the next afternoon. "They're coming, boss," he yelled, his horse lathered in sweat. "Thorne and a dozen men. They're armed for war." The world narrowed to the ranch house and the stretch of land leading up to it. The quiet valley was about to become a battlefield. Silas moved with a deadly calm, his years of lonely discipline now channeled into a sharp, strategic mind. He issued orders to Clay and the handful of loyal ranch hands. They weren't an army, but they were determined men defending their home. "Elara, get upstairs," Silas commanded, his voice tight. "Take the journal and stay away from the windows. Bar the door." "No," she said, her voice firm, surprising them both. "I'm not hiding. I can load rifles. I can help." Silas looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and he saw not a liability to be protected, but a partner. A flicker of a pained smile touched his lips. "All right," he conceded. "Stay in the kitchen. It's the most protected room." He pressed a rifle into her hands. "You know how to use this?" "My father taught me," she said, her hands steady as she checked the action. The house grew quiet as they waited. The ranch hands took up positions in the barn and behind a low stone wall that bordered the yard. Silas stood by the front window, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm, a grim sentinel guarding his fortress. Elara waited in the kitchen, her own rifle resting on the table, her heart a steady, heavy drum against her ribs. She was terrified, but she was not afraid. She was no longer the girl on the auction block. She was the mistress of this house, a wife defending her home and the man she had, she realized with a sudden, startling clarity, come to love. The sound came first, the thunder of approaching hooves. Then they appeared, a dark line of horsemen cresting the ridge, with Jedediah Thorne at their head. They stopped just out of rifle range, a pack of wolves circling their prey. "Blackwood," Thorne's voice, amplified by his rage, echoed across the yard. "You have something that belongs to me. Send out the girl and the papers she stole, and I'll let you and your men live." Silas stepped out onto the porch, a solitary, defiant figure. "Her name is Mrs. Blackwood," he called back, his voice calm and carrying. "And you're trespassing. This is your only warning, Thorne. Turn around and ride away." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's stolen property. I have a right to reclaim what's mine." He raised his hand and pointed at the house. "I'll burn this place to the ground to get it." "Then you'll die on my land," Silas said, and with a smooth, deliberate motion he raised his Winchester and fired. The shot wasn't aimed at a man, but at the dirt in front of Thorne's horse. It was the final word. The negotiation was over. The first gunshot from Thorne's men shattered a parlor window, and the air exploded into a cacophony of rifle fire. The world dissolved into the roar of guns and the splintering of wood. Elara stayed in the kitchen as ordered, her body tense, her ears ringing. She could hear Silas moving through the house, firing from different windows, his shots measured and deliberate. The ranch hands in the barn returned fire, creating a crossfire that kept Thorne's men pinned down. Glass shattered in the dining room. A bullet thudded into the thick kitchen wall, sending a shower of plaster onto the floor. Elara flinched but held her ground, her knuckles white on the stock of her rifle. Her role was to wait, to be the last line of defense if the house was breached. The waiting was its own kind of torture. After what felt like an eternity, there was a lull in the fighting. Elara crept to the edge of the kitchen doorway, peering into the main hall. Silas was reloading by the front window, his face a mask of grim concentration. He saw her, and his expression softened for a half-second. "Stay back," he mouthed. Suddenly a new sound, a crash of wood from the back of the house. Two of Thorne's men had broken through the back door. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. Before Silas could react, they were in the hallway. One of them raised his pistol, aiming at Silas's exposed back. There was no time to think, no time to call out. Elara raised her rifle, sighted down the barrel, and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The man aiming at Silas grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the floor. The second man turned, his eyes wide with surprise, and Silas was on him, his rifle butt swinging in a brutal arc. The fight was short and savage. In the sudden silence that followed, Silas stood over the two groaning men, breathing heavily. He looked at Elara, who was standing frozen, the rifle still pressed to her shoulder, a curl of smoke rising from the barrel. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and overwhelming relief. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, taking the rifle from her trembling hands. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest in an embrace that was fierce and protective. "I told you to stay put," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't," she whispered against his chest. "I couldn't let him." He held her tighter, his hand stroking her back. "I know." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. The grim mask was gone, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded love. "I didn't know I could feel this again," he said, his voice husky. "I love you, Elara. Not as a contract, not as a message. I love you." In the midst of chaos and violence, with the battle still raging outside, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, desperate gratitude, a seal on a vow that had been unspoken until now. The sound of renewed gunfire outside broke them apart. Thorne was making a final, desperate push. "It's almost over," Silas said, his voice filled with a new, unshakable resolve. He was no longer just defending his land, he was defending his wife, his home, his future. He handed her a pistol, just in case. Then he turned back to the fight, a man reborn. The final confrontation happened in the open yard. Thorne, his numbers dwindling and his attack failing, grew desperate. In a mad rage, he charged the house on foot, his pistol blazing. Silas met him on the porch. It was no longer a battle. It was an execution. Silas fired once. Thorne stumbled, fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the dust of the yard he had so desperately coveted. His remaining men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They threw down their guns and surrendered to Clay and the other ranch hands. Silence fell over the valley, broken only by the groaning of the wounded and the distant, startled cry of a hawk. The war was over. In the aftermath, the world slowly came back into focus. Elara stepped out onto the porch, the pistol hanging limply in her hand. She looked at the devastation, the shattered windows, the bullet-pocked walls, the still form of Jedediah Thorne lying in the dirt. It was a brutal, ugly sight, but it was the sight of freedom. Silas came to her side, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. He was covered in dust and grime, but his eyes were clear. The ghosts that had haunted them were finally gone. "It's over," he said softly, his voice full of a weary relief. They stood there for a long time, watching as the sun began to set, painting the bruised sky with colors of hope and promise. A few days later, the territorial marshal finally arrived, a stern, capable man with a steely gaze. He listened to their story, read the damning entries in her father's journal, and took the sworn statements of Silas's men. He looked at the map of the artesian spring and gave a low whistle. "This explains a lot," he said, clapping the journal shut. "Thorne has been a cancer in this valley for years. With this, we can undo all of it." The law, slow but sure, began to work its course. Thorne's corrupt empire crumbled. The sheriff in redemption was arrested. The fraudulent deeds were nullified. Lands were returned to families who had been cheated for years. Elara's family farm was legally hers again, its name cleared of all debt and shame. One evening, she and Silas rode out to the property. It was overgrown and neglected, but the house her father had built still stood strong. "What will you do with it?" Silas asked, his voice gentle. Elara looked at the small farmhouse, then back at the vast, sprawling expanse of the Blackwood Ranch in the distance. "A home is not just land or a house," she said, looking at him, her heart full. "It's the people in it. My home is with you, Silas." She reached out and took his scarred hand in hers. "But perhaps our land could use a guaranteed source of water." Silas looked at her, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a sight more beautiful than any sunrise. It reached his eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice thick with love, "I think that's the best idea I've ever heard." 1 year later, Elara stood on the porch of the main house, her head resting on Silas's shoulder. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, his hand resting protectively on the gentle swell of her belly. The house behind them was no longer a silent mausoleum. Its windows were open, letting in the sounds of life. The scent of baking bread wafted from the kitchen, and the happy chatter of ranch hands drifted up from the bunkhouse. The garden she had resurrected was a riot of color and life, the rose bushes climbing the trellis Silas had built for them. The valley below was peaceful, thriving under the shared stewardship of the combined ranches. The artesian spring, now known as the Vance Spring, provided water for all, a symbol of the community's rebirth. Silas Blackwood was no longer the lonely, scarred recluse of rumor and legend. He was a man transformed, his quiet strength now a source of comfort rather than intimidation. He laughed often, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to shake the foundations of the house, waking it from its long slumber. Elara, the orphan girl from the auction block, was now the heart of this vast domain, her resilience and love having healed not just a man but an entire community. She had been bought, sold, and rescued, but in the end she had found her own power, not in defiance but in her capacity to love and build. She had faced down a monster and in doing so had saved a good man from himself. Silas pressed a soft kiss to her temple. "Are you happy, Elara?" he murmured. She smiled, a deep, contented smile that radiated a profound sense of peace. "More than I ever thought possible," she whispered. She looked out at the endless expanse of land, their land, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was a kingdom built not on wealth or power, but on the bedrock of second chances. The millionaire rancher had married the girl he rescued from the auction block, but in saving her he had truly, finally saved himself. Together they had built a new legacy, not of loss, but of a love as strong and enduring as the mountains that watched over their home.